This is a Fox San Antonio special.
During the Cretaceous period, 240 to 65 million years ago, what we know now as Texas was very different.
This was all part of a shallow sea many millions of years ago.
This sea was rich with life, small and large. The remains of ancient life forms that died in the sea sank to the bottom, and over the years created large deposits of limestone. Changes in the land movement pushed the sea out, exposing the limestone. When the limestone was exposed, erosion created cavities and caves that allowed the limestone to hold water. 3,000 years ago, movements in the land pushed the limestone up and out of the sea one last time, creating the Balcones escarpment and moving the water out to where it is today.
So we have the Balcones fault zone that's along the edge of this uplifted limestone. And so precipitation falls on these high elevation areas, form these rivers, and these rivers flow off the plateau across the Balcones fault zone, eventually going down towards the Gulf.
The Guadalupe was just a river until someone gave it a name. The indigenous people of the land, the Tonkawa, likely called it Aha. The story of its present-day name begins on November the 5th, 1528. This is when Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca shipwrecked on this island and was enslaved by the Karankawa tribe. After 6 years with the tribe, he led 3 survivors on a trek westward to what he thought was California. On his way, he came across a river that had numerous pecan trees. He named it the River of Nuts, and thus the river had its first European name. 161 years later, a Spanish explorer, Alonso de Leon, led 4 expeditions into what is now South Texas. He was searching for a reported French settlement, Fort St. Louis. His 4th expedition took him to an area south of what is now Runge, Texas. He then turned southward, reaching a river near Nursery, Texas. He named that river Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. The river now had its 2nd European name. So where does the Guadalupe River come from? It all goes back to that limestone that was made millions of years ago.
You look across the coast of Texas on the Gulf of Mexico, and you see streams, going away up into the upper parts of the high plains of Texas, across the Balcones escarpment, and then down across the coastal plain.
It's very different up on the plateau than it is down in the Gulf. Up in the plateau, as that plateau was lifted over geologic time, these rivers started incising down into the rock, and it was like a hot wire going through butter. Once they start on that channel, they stay in that channel, which is much different than the Mississippi.
Well, a lot of the water in the river that we see flowing is not actually from a rainfall event somewhere, but it's being fed by groundwater from underneath.
The Guadalupe River originates in western Kerr County, where water from the Edwards Trinity Plateau kind of pushes its way up through the rock and starts to flow over land. And those areas where you have the groundwater transitioning to surface water, those are springs. The North Fork and the South Fork are the primary parts of the river in the western part of Kerr County, and where they come together and hunt is just upstream of Shoemaker Crossing, and that marks the official part of the Guadalupe River, the official start of the Guadalupe River.
Well, rivers are very important in our lives, and if we think of the history of the United States in particular, rivers were early on one of the primary ways that people moved themselves as well as goods long distances. The American Indians used water in the Southwest water from rivers in the Southwest to irrigate their crops of beans and corn, and they remain essential to this day. We use rivers to generate power, We dam rivers, of course, to provide a more secure water supply, to generate hydroelectric electricity. And another key thing with rivers is they're great sources of recreation for people.
It's such a beautiful river. The water's clear. It's a rocky base, so you've got pebbles, you've got rocks, you've got beautiful rapids. It kind of flows in between rapids and deep holes where you've got Guadalupe bass, the state fish of Texas, is in the Guadalupe River. This river can be dramatically different. This is actually a pretty low. With it being September, it's always a kind of a low ebb.
The Guadalupe is a river of many personalities, both good and bad. When we come back, what drives the personalities of this river and changes it so dramatically?
It is a gorgeous river. It's a river that extends from Kerr County through Guadalupe River State Park. The reason we have Guadalupe State Park is because of the Guadalupe River, and of course goes all the way down to the Bay of San Antonio.
People have always flocked to the Guadalupe River, ever since it was first colonized, because it was a source of life, a source of water, a quality of life component, and also a part of the local economy.
The Guadalupe River has its beginnings within ancient limestone formations in western Kerr County, where it bubbles up out of the ground in two places.
The North Fork and the South Fork are the primary parts of the river in the western part of Kerr County, and where they come together and hunt is just upstream of Shoemaker Crossing, and that marks the official part of the Guadalupe River, the official start of the Guadalupe River.
The river travels for hundreds of miles, dropping off the plateau, meandering southward until it reaches the Gulf of Mexico.
It's very different up on the plateau than it is down in the Gulf. Up in the plateau, as that plateau was lifted over geologic time, these rivers started incising down into the rock. And it was like a hot wire going through butter. Up on the rock, up on the Edwards Plateau, it'll stay in those channels, but it'll move around the floodplain a little bit. So you'll see some minor movement, but that channel is going to stay set.
The Guadalupe can be slow and peaceful, but don't be fooled. It can change personality quickly, becoming a raging torrent.
It's something you better respect, or you're going to incur some real serious consequences.
There are four drivers of the Guadalupe's personality: land type, soil depth, slope of the land, and rainfall. The land of the plateau is primarily limestone, with the river cutting a hard channel right into the rock. This sets the stage for funneling water through these limestone channels like a log flume ride. The shallow soils and the slope of the land are big factors to increasing the speed of the water flow of the river. The biggest driver of how the Guadalupe behaves is rainfall.
Because of the topography of the steep slopes, very shallow soils, sharp canyons, when it rains, that water comes off the surface very quickly and can increase the water levels and have the rivers go out of their banks very quickly as well.
Well, you have to remember that right along the Balcones Fault, you have some of the largest rainfalls in the world.
We do have a huge number of heavy rain events in south central Texas. Some of them are just absolutely nightmarish.
Central Texas is the most flash flood prone area in the United States, and the National Weather Service terms it Flash Flood Alley.
South Central Texas is no stranger to heavy rainfall events. The region is covered with 20-inch rainfalls. The top 10 rainfall events brought rainfall totals near or above 20 inches.
And that happens because you have these storms coming from the west, you have these storms coming out of the Gulf, you have storms coming out of the east, and they park right over this area. And when they stall, you can get 20 inches of rain in 24 hours.
So if you're raining heavily down along a river, you're just increasing the volume in that river, and you're increasing the amount that's going down the channel.
And when you have these huge rain events that are focused over a small watershed, it can have devastating impact in terms of the power of that water. That's why you have these flood stages that are 20, 30 feet over the base flow.
1978 is one that comes up frequently. So that was when remnants of a tropical storm came in and kind of just set over the watershed divide between the Medina River and the Guadalupe River. So in between here and Bandera, it dumped about 30 inches of rain.
When it rains, it usually pours, and that can mean a quick personality change and big trouble along the Guadalupe River.
This river can be dramatically different. This is actually a pretty low, with it being September, it's always a kind of a low ebb. But we've had days where they get rain up in Kerrville, we've had three major floods in the last 4 years. And where we're standing right now, we would have been under probably about 30 or 40 feet of water here.
The climatic pattern in Texas swings from drought to flood to drought and back to flood. The state receives much of its annual rainfall in bursts with just a few large storms. Dry air moves in from the Rocky Mountains and collides with the warm tropical air moving in from the Gulf of Mexico. The result? World record rainfall rates like the 38 inches that fell in just 24 hours near Thrall, Texas in 1921. Tropical systems are responsible for major rainfall events in the region. These systems move in from the Gulf of Mexico and sometimes the Pacific coast, creating massive inland flooding events. The rainfall event of 1998 is a good example. When we come back, the simple feature that's behind our massive rainfalls and what the Guadalupe did that left forecasters shaking their heads. The Guadalupe River begins at 2,400 feet in the high plateau north of Kerrville. It runs for 230 miles, passing through Kerr, Kendall, Comal, Guadalupe, Gonzales, DeWitt, and Victoria counties before it arrives at the Gulf of Mexico. Its drainage area covers 6,070 miles. The region is well known for climate swings.
We know that our weather goes like this, right? I mean, we know that we have this regular cycle of drought, flood, drought, flood, drought, flood. One of the biggest natural cycles that affects us here in Texas is El Nino and La Nina. So this pattern of dry, wet that we see as far back as we can go in history here in Texas, that comes from El Nino and from other cycles.
During La Nina, or neutral years, tropical systems are responsible for major rainfall events in the region. One simple feature of the land works to enhance rainfall over the high plateau of the hill country. This simple feature is the slope of the land. Going from sea level to just over 2,400 feet, warm Gulf air moving inland is forced to rise over the Balcones escarpment. It's a process called orographic lift. The lifting of warm, moist air creates storms over the Guadalupe headwaters.
And when you have these huge rain events that are focused over a small watershed, it can have devastating impact in terms of the power of that water. That's why you have these flood stages that are 20, 30 feet over the base flow. You have to remember that right along the Balcones Fault, you have some of the largest rainfalls in the world.
The rainfall event of 1998 is a good example.
Wow, it was an event that is unusual in so many ways. It was precipitated because two dying hurricanes off the west coast of Mexico both parked in the position to put a ton of mid and upper level moisture into South Texas.
All that was needed was a trigger to start the rain-making process.
It was somewhere around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning that burp occurred, and suddenly storms began to form. Through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, it just didn't stop. It began to move slowly out of Bexar County. It's really, if you track the movement of the heaviest of the rain, it probably pretty closely followed the Guadalupe River. That was one really dangerous situation. We found that the river just didn't obey the rules.
All the flood gauges along the river said major flood, but nobody believed them.
In '98, I was the night shift deputy, and I was on patrol during the night. It had been raining throughout the week, so it was pretty nasty out anyway. One of my assignments is throughout the night go and check the river levels to make sure that if there were any road closures, that we got those things closed off pretty quick. I received a phone call that there was an elderly couple trapped in their house. I drove down there. Immediately saw that there was just no way we could get to the house. And I started noticing that the water was coming across the valleys of Highway 183, which I grew up here and I'd never seen that happen ever before. Had it not been for some really gutsy helicopter pilots, they probably wouldn't have got out. The folks on the west end had no electricity, no fuel. The water was over all of our bridges.
Some people literally discovered the flood when it started coming into their house.
We could literally see the water rising from where it was. And I mean, it was moving so fast that where we would stand 5 minutes later would be ankle deep in water.
The Guadalupe River surged downstream, wiping out river gauges on its way to Cuero. The river rose to over 50 feet on October 20th, 1998. That's almost 49 feet above flood stage. 680 homes were destroyed, 7,000 cattle were lost, and thousands of acres of farmland decimated.
This river went to something like 7 miles wide, something that people could not recall ever having happened in written history. This brought every single river in south central Texas, east and along and east of I-35, to a record crest. So we had reset every single river crest for all of south central Texas except the Rio Grande.
It was just a surreal moment. The important thing is that nobody died there. They all got out, and we were just ecstatic about that. One of the most interesting artifacts I found that night was a piece of a picnic table that said, property of Schlitterbahn.
Overall, the 1998 flood claimed 21 lives. It would be less than 10 years later when the rains would once again send the river raging downstream. The upper part of the Guadalupe River originates in Kerr County and flows across the Edwards Plateau and over the Balcones Escarpment. The region is noted for its extensive rainfall events.
It's unpredictable. People tend to see it in between the dam areas where it's nice and placid and pools, and forget that there's a whole nother side of when it rains, and it doesn't take much to set it in motion and get it to really move on.
Because of the topography of the steep slopes, very shallow soils, sharp canyons, when it rains, that water comes off the surface very quickly and can increase the water levels and have the rivers go out of their banks very quickly as well.
So we call this flash flood alley for a reason. First of all, flash flooding is our #1 storm-related killer here in south central Texas, and there are several ingredients that come into play. Population boom that's taking place in this region, you start putting more people into an area that is prone to flash flooding, and you're going to get more fatalities.
Flooding is not an unusual event for south central Texas. There's truth to the saying that when it rains, it pours. The region receives much of its rainfall from a few large storms with world record-setting rainfalls.
Every few years we get something like this where we see the antecedent conditions of just prolonged heavy rainfall that leads to saturated soils, and then we get one big event. Sometimes they can happen in the middle of the night, unfortunately, where you get 12 to 15 to 20 inches of rain that falls. in the springtime, in May, that's when you're getting all your ingredients for storms. You're still getting the cold fronts that come down. And you start getting into June and tropical systems that can get involved with stalling cold fronts. That can lead to heavy rainfall.
Historically, nearly 80% of all natural disasters in the United States involve flooding. Texas holds half of the world record rainfall rates, and 20 million acres in the state are flood-prone, more than any other state. Tropical systems are major contributors to flood events. The top 5 tropical rainfall events range from 39 inches in Thrall, Texas, to 64 inches in Nederland, Texas. Hurricane Harvey's rain took the Guadalupe River out of its banks, with a 31-foot crest in Victoria, Texas, flooding the west side of the city. The Guadalupe River has another personality.
You know, the Guadalupe is really known as a recreational river to a lot of people. The river is also a water supply for cities of San Marcos and New Braunfels and the other cities that are dotted along our basin. And it's also an important resource for San Antonio. In the 1930s, the state of Texas created a series of river authorities. And the GBRA, Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, which was created in 1933, is one of those. There are about 24. Each one of these river authorities was going to create water supplies and power supplies and help not only with reducing flooding, but also economic development within each individual river basin.
Further up the river, near its headwaters, the Upper Guadalupe River Authority keeps an eye on the river.
We have about 40 sites that we monitor on a routine basis for water quality, and we look at how that changes over time so that we're able to assess any, unfortunate declines in water quality and put projects in place to improve that. Probably our biggest concern for water quality in the upper part of the basin is stormwater runoff or non-point source pollution. And nationwide, even really worldwide, that's probably our biggest threat to freshwater bodies.
The flow of water in the Guadalupe can range from over 450,000 cubic feet per second, close to the flow of the Mississippi River, down to zero flow. Those 0 times are the opposite extremes. While the region is no stranger to flooding, it also knows extreme drought.
It's a bit of a misnomer to refer to average precipitation in south central Texas. It's never average. You have 2 years of drought followed by 6 weeks of flooding. So that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's close to reality.
Trying to plan for those extremes is difficult, and it's also expensive because you've got to have a supply that can be assured of water throughout a drought.
The complex nature of the Earth's climate make it a challenge to predict drought. It is done by keeping a close eye on rainfall, temperatures, soil moisture, and ocean cycles that take our climate to the extremes.
Part of it is to kind of be able to stretch out that supply, given that you don't know how long each drought's going to last.
There's very little you can do without water. So you ask what can be done around here, you have to live within your means. And that may require changing habits and patterns and the way people tend their gardens and their yards.
This has been a Fox San Antonio special.